Brown.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Bradford East, and I hope his front bench was listening to his and some of his other fellow member contributions, because I think that's important if we're talking about plans to actually remedy things and actually help the poorest in our society. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is clearly a zombie budget from a zombie government. A budget that's so good, as others have said, we've got practically empty backbenches over there. If it's meant to be a pre-election budget, then it's a pre-election budget that's certainly not generating any confidence in the backbenchers from the Conservative Party, because none of them want to be here to debate it and try and talk it up. Now, it's a bold Chancellor that tells us he's cutting taxes when we still have the highest tax burden in 70 years, with more tax rises on the way, and at the same time as living standards continue to fall. Now, just today, Ofgem's announced that the energy cap is going to increase in January again, and will still be approximately double what the energy costs were 2 years ago. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's little wonder that the OBR predict living standards will be, this year will be 3.5% lower than pre-pandemic. And the Chancellor is also bold enough to talk about wage growth. But then when we look at the detail, the Resolution Foundations confirm that it's going to take until the year 2028 to get wages overall back to 2008 wage levels. Two lost decades of wage growth. And this will be the first Parliament ever where households will have lower incomes than Parliament started when we come to the next general election. So it's quite clear then that this budget does nothing then for the approximately 6.3 million households who are fuel poor. And Ofgem have now also confirmed record energy cumulative debts of £2.6 billion. So we really are still in the grip of a cost of energy crisis. And yet the Tories tell us how we should have been grateful for the energy support package, which cost in the order of £40 billion. But if we look elsewhere, if we look at Norway, Norway has drawn a further £30 billion from their sovereign wealth fund this year alone. Now, Norway have drawn £30 billion from their sovereign wealth fund, won't even make a dent in their £1.1 trillion. Yes, Norway's got a £1.1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, the biggest wealth fund in the world. Yet energy-rich Scotland still exports 6 times oil and gas it produces, and we're supposed to be grateful that the UK as a whole is planning to slightly reduce its £2.5 trillion debt. All these oil and gas revenues just frittered away in short-term planning. Now, if we look at it overall too, Norway didn't create their fund until the 1990s, so it really is a disgrace that we do not have a North Sea legacy to fall back on in these hard times. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are also supposed to be grateful about the 2% cut to national insurance contributions. Grateful that the Tories claim to have reduced inflation from 11.4% when they were partly responsible for the high rate due to the previous disastrous mini-budget and the Brexit impacts. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a curious matter given that the Government tell us they're not responsible for high inflation, given high inflation is a global issue. They tell us that high interest rates are set by the wholly independent Bank of England, but yet now inflation has fallen. Now we're at the autumn statement. Somehow we're to believe it's the Government's actions that have brought inflation down. So we appear to have a government who is only responsible for inflation rates when it's good news and they're way down, which is quite a trick indeed. Now, if we return to household energy, it's a scandal that about a fifth of the households in the UK are living in fuel poverty. It's a bigger scandal that energy-rich Scotland has fuel poverty at all, and indeed, unfortunately, some of the highest energy bills in the UK and pay some of the highest standing charges across the UK just to access the energy grid. Standing charges that mean people cannot afford to heat their home properly. Indeed, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has estimated that around 2 million people across the UK are switching off their fridge and freezers intermittently to save in energy costs. So this budget will do nothing to help these people, or if it does, any money that goes into their pockets in January will quickly be removed in April due to the tax thresholds freeze, and when more people become liable for income tax. And the reality is that in energy costs, households are paying an average £800 a year more compared to 2 years ago. And yet, by comparison, the One Home Discount Scheme has increased from £140 a year to £150 a year. So it's plain the sums do not add up. And yet the government has also reneged in their pledge to bring forward a social tariff to help the most vulnerable with their energy costs. And Mr Deputy Speaker, if we look at the national insurance cut in the round, while hard-working people, especially those around about the eligibility threshold, paying less is of course welcome, it's unfortunately no coincidence that the £19 billion package to support the national insurance cut is going to be offset by £19 billion of public spending cuts still to be determined. Yeah. Now, who gets affected most by public spending cuts? Of course, it's the same lowest paid and the poorest in our society. So such spending cuts actually makes a further mockery of the government's so-called levelling up agenda. A levelling up department, when we look at it in the budget, in the statement, the levelling up department's budget is going to be halved, which kind of says everything going forward about the levelling up targets. And Mr Deputy Speaker, if the government introduces a tax cut via emergency legislation to bring it forward to be paid for by future departmental cuts, they cannot possibly claim this is part of a responsible government taking long-term decisions for the future in terms of the economy. It's quite clearly a contract, it's quite clearly a gimmick to try and capture some headlines. And of course in Scotland, though, we've also to be grateful about Barnett consequentials. Barnett consequentials actually already turned out to be less than was previously predicted from announcements that was trailed. Barnett consequentials, while the Scottish Block grant itself has actually been cut in real terms, because if we look at the grant in the autumn statement, the grant next year increases from £35.8 billion to £36.9 billion. But if we compare the increase with headline inflation from September, then it's quite clear that's a real terms budget cut to the Scottish budget of around 3.5% or £1.3 billion. Then there's the capital budget allocated to the Scottish Government being cut outright from £6.2 billion to £5.6 billion in 2 years' time. So that's not even a real terms budget cut, but a hugely damaging slashing of the budget. And that comes at the same time when the Scottish Tories simultaneously demand the Scottish Government invest in all sorts of infrastructure project schemes. So I'm sure going forward the Scottish Tories will recognise this conundrum. With a cut budget, they will demand the capital budget is restored, and surely they will recognise the pressures in the Scottish Government, let alone the inflationary pressures in the projects already underway. And yes, as my old friend points out, of course they're not here to talk up this budget. Mr Deputy Speaker, meanwhile in terms of infrastructure, yet again we're being let down by the lack of progress in agreeing an electricity cap and floor mechanism for pumped storage hydro, which means further delays in SSE's Corrie Glass scheme and Drax's Cruachan Dam extension. Now we keep hearing about the government want to unlock private investment, but yet in terms of pumped storage hydro, there's private investment in the order of £2 to £2.5 billion that will be unlocked by agreeing an electricity export mechanism for these schemes. It will create jobs in the Highlands of Scotland, but importantly, it will provide better balance for the grid overall and reduce energy bills. So why do we have this continued intransigence from the government regards pumped storage hydro? And despite talk of investment in green energy, the autumn statement in the Green Book does not even mention energy storage once. So this is a real dereliction of duty. Tidal stream, where Scotland leads the way, is not mentioned either. And if we look at the statement in detail, the so-called £4.5 billion manufacturing investment, the £960 million Green Growth Accelerator, do not even have corresponding budget lines. So it's quite clear that these announcements would appear to be recycled announcements in the finest style of this government. But of course we know, and there was talk about it, but the indicative blank cheque for nuclear is mentioned once again. The fantasy of small modular reactors. Now firstly, they're not actually small. They exceed the industry definition in terms of generation capacity. But secondly, Mr Deputy Speaker, these so-called SMRs are the size of 2 football pitches, so clearly not exactly a small footprint either. So that's a terminology designed to make them sound small and cosy when they're anything but. Now, if we look at evidence, the development of these projects, the most advanced SMR project in the world, NewScale in Utah, has just been shelved. because capital costs have increased to $9 billion US dollars, the equivalent of over £7 billion pounds sterling. So here we have the evidence that these SMRs are actually too expensive to progress. £7 billion equivalent in the United States. But somehow here the UK government is pretending that they can deliver them for £2 billion a reactor. It makes no sense, especially nuclear technology is generally more expensive in the UK anyway. And then we come to my hobby horse, Sizewell C. Now, despite the fact that Hinkley Point C has increased in cost from £18 billion to £33 billion, despite the fact we've still got rampant inflation in terms of the construction industry, despite the fact that Sizewell C will be built in an area that is subject to coastal erosion and flood risk, we are told that somehow Sizewell C will be magically cheaper than Hinkley Point C, and it will provide value for money. It's truly delusional, and the fact that no pension funds want to invest in Sizewell C, and the government's got the begging bowl out despite introducing the regulated asset base model, transferring further risk to bill payers, are still struggling to raise finance. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's time the government ends this charade. It's bad enough that over £1 billion has already been spent just in design development for Sizewell C. That's £1 billion that could have been spent in energy efficiency measures, it could have been spent in infrastructure, or even it could have been used for further energy support schemes. I'll give the...
I'm grateful to the honourable friend for giving me on the point of energy efficiency measures. Is he surprised, disappointed, or is it purely to be expected there's not a single word about insulation or energy efficiency measures anywhere in this autumn statement?
All of the above, actually. It's really infuriating, and if the government actually listens to even the energy supply companies want the government to invest more in energy efficiency and energy insulation. And what's happening right now in terms of the Eco4 scheme is that the companies can't even find the right requisite number of properties to upgrade. So as that goes on, we're actually losing supply chain instead of building up supply chain. So if we really want green growth and green jobs and lower energy bills, then it's perfectly obvious more money should be spent in energy efficiency. And ironically, the government never listened to this, but they also want to listen to the third sector and the energy companies who praise the Scottish Government for their direct investment in support of energy efficiency programmes. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, in contrast to the government's blank cheque for nuclear, meanwhile Scottish renewable projects still have to pay the grid charging penalty, making it harder for them to compete in the CFD auctions. So what this means overall, in terms of this budget, we've still got an incoherent energy policy. It does nothing for Scotland. Hard-working families are still going to suffer going forward. Living standards are still falling, and we know the disabled are now threatened with losing support unless they are forced into jobs not of their choosing. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not difficult to choose a different path for Scotland, a path that other smaller countries in Western Europe are already on. So why not Scotland? It's time we took that different route.
The wind-ups.